Good evening. My name is Enrique Goitisolo, and I am the active president of the Fairhaven Historical Society. On behalf of the organization, I would like to welcome our guest speaker, Mr. Charles Slack. But I will share a little thing about him with you. Mr. Slack, a graduate of Harvard University, was a newspaper reporter in Tennessee and Virginia. Currently, he works as a business and financial writer, editor, and lives with his family in Connecticut. Mr. Slack is an award-winning author of several fascinating books. His latest is entitled Liberty's First Crisis: Adams, Jefferson, and the Misfits Who Saved Free Speech. Also, critically acclaimed novel Obsession, which is based on the life of inventor Charles Goodyear. The New York Public Library named this book one of the 25 best books to remember. But the book Mr. Slack will address tonight, Hetty, hits closer to our South Coast home. It examines the life of the legendary Mrs. Hetty Green. It is a splendid portrait of one of the greatest and most eccentric financiers in American history. You will see why the biography was recognized and as unfaithful and influential, winning awards such as the Connecticut State Book Award and the Elle Magazine Reader's Prize. Tonight's talk will last 30 to 40 minutes, and then Mr. Slack will answer questions from the audience. Then he will be signing books for those who brought them in or who would like to purchase them. Hetty's book will be $25 each. Now, I am delighted to introduce Mr. Charles Slack. Please join me in giving him a hearty round. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricky, for that wonderful introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? It's incredible. This is just such a wonderful, wonderful audience. And it's great to be here. I want to thank the Historical Society, Ricky and the other members, and Mark Badway for extending the invitation and also giving me a tour earlier of this beautiful town. And even on a gray, blustery, spitting rain day, one of the most beautiful towns I think I've ever seen. It's just a real pleasure to be here. I wrote this book, the Hetty, the Genius and Madness of America's First Female Tycoon, a number of years ago, and it was a real pleasure getting to know New Bedford and the area, doing some research at the Whaling Museum, at the Public Library in Dartmouth and other places, and getting to know people like, I don't know how many people here remember Edie Nichols? Yeah, so a wonderful character, a wonderful woman, and she ran a small museum in New Bedford, and she was so kind to me when I was doing my research. Before I talk, I want to start off with a brief video.
Probably her life was happy. At any rate, she had enough of courage to choose as she chose and to be as thrifty as she pleased, and she observed such of the world's conventions as seemed to her right and useful, coldly and calmly ignoring all the others. The New York Times, 1916. My first real sort of understanding of who she was came when my mother told me about a silver tray that we had in the family that had supposedly been given to us by this fabulously wealthy woman from the 19th century named Hetty Green. Her growing up in the whaling culture of New Bedford, Massachusetts, her storming Wall Street in the late 1800s, her adventures with high finance and her battles with Gilded Age robber barons, all made for the stuff of a wonderful story. Hetty Green's father was a man named Edward Robinson. He was a very astute businessman. He was very thrifty. He was industrious. I think it's safe to say that she spent her life sort of trying to emulate this father figure that she loved and admired. And her son, Ned, she groomed to take over her financial enterprises, and he became sort of a larger-than-life figure. Spent money in ways that Hetty never would have approved of, lived in fabulous mansions. Her daughter, Sylvia, named for Hetty's Aunt Sylvia, she sort of never pushed into finance, never tried to make her somebody in her own mold. In many ways, a more responsible steward of wealth, so to speak. So it's kind of ironic that Hetty, while herself a pioneering feminist, perpetuated these rather conventional roles for her kids. One of the great early battles of her life was over the fortune of her Aunt Sylvia, who had never married and had a fortune of about $2 million. And Hetty was determined that she be the sole heir because she felt she knew how to invest that money and take care of it and shepherd it. And it ultimately revealed that Hetty had quite probably forged the signature of her Aunt Sylvia. She did some highly unattractive things. For example, she took her son to free medical clinics. She could be seen haggling in grocery stores over day-old bread, buying broken cookies because they were cheaper. She could also be surprisingly generous. She lived in Hoboken apartment buildings very modestly and would stay up with neighbors who were sick and nurse them through the night. She loaned money to churches. She bailed out the city of New York on a couple of occasions when New York was running low on money. One of Hetty's most remarkable and admirable and too often overlooked qualities was her financial genius. She adhered to the words of advice that are the easiest to say but the hardest to follow, which is to buy low, sell high, and don't panic during a panic. Hetty Green is unfairly remembered for her personal oddities, for being a miser, for being the witch of Wall Street. And I think that it's important to remember her as a pioneering woman, somebody who stood up for herself, knew she had the capabilities. For all of her wealth, she always thought of herself as an outsider. She didn't think of herself as one of the corporate leaders or financial leaders or great bankers of the age. She saw herself as a lone individual standing up for her rights.
I got the idea for the book from my mother, who is here tonight, drove up with me from Connecticut, and she told me that she... Wow. She told me that she had a book idea for me, and that there was this tray in the family that had, as the story goes, been given to one of our ancestors by this woman, Hetty Green, and that I should really look into her. And it led me to believe even more firmly in the adage, listen to your mother. But at the time that I began to at the time that she made that suggestion to me, I think if I knew anything at all about Hetty Green, it was from the Guinness Book of World Records, which listed her for many years under the heading World's Greatest Miser. And that entry read in part, she was so mean that her son had to have his leg amputated because of delays in finding a free medical clinic. She herself lived off cold oatmeal because she was too mean to heat it, and died of apoplexy in an argument over the virtues of skimmed milk. Now, she did eat oatmeal in the chemical bank. She brought rather than buy lunch often, but she heated it on a radiator, so it wasn't true that it was cold. Fact checking. But as I looked into her life, I found an extraordinarily complex and compelling woman far ahead of her time. Hetty Green was, during her life, almost certainly the wealthiest woman in America, and she was, without question, the only woman to accumulate a fortune of such magnitude largely through her own skills as an investor and a businesswoman. Though not an up-from-nothing story, she took a family inheritance of several $1 million, much of it tied up in trusts run by men whom she knew to be her inferiors in terms of financial skills, and turned it into one of the colossal fortunes of the Gilded Age. She bought and sold railroads and gold and silver mines, owned large chunks of real estate in New York, Chicago, and elsewhere, and was one of the rare figures of her own age or any age with the power to move markets. She died in 1916 with a fortune estimated at $100 million, or close to about anywhere from $3 billion to $16 billion today, depending on how you calculate the figures. When a pair of business professors in the 1990s ranked the 100 wealthiest self-made Americans as a percentage of the gross national product, Hetty, the only woman on the list, came in 36th, 3 places ahead of Warren Buffett. And she did all this at a time when women didn't have so much as the right to vote. Now, what about those mean miser stories? Well, there's a lot of truth to those. Some truth, some urban legend. I did research in New Bedford and Bellows Falls, Vermont, in New York City, and in Hoboken, New Jersey, and everywhere I went, there was a cottage industry of Hetty Green miser stories. There was the $2 dog license in Hoboken for her beloved dog that caused her to nearly leave the city. She was so upset about paying it. There was the time when she spent all night in Bellows Falls, Vermont, searching frantically for a lost 2-cent stamp. There was the banker in New York City who loved to tell the story about looking out the window one day and seeing Hetty getting off of a public streetcar carrying a black bag, and he went out and said to her, "Mrs. Green, you really should be taking private carriages." And she looked at him sharply and said, "Perhaps you can afford a private carriage, I cannot." And as he told it, the bag contained $200,000 in bonds. But, you know, she was a woman of contradictions, but that was sort of what made her fascinating to research and write about. She was pathologically close with a nickel, no question about that. But as you saw in the video, she would stay up with ill neighbors, nursing them. She gave piggy banks to neighbor children with incentives to save. She was sharp-tongued and harsh, and yet had a quick, bright sense of humor. In her older years, she wore long, black, unkempt gowns. That was sort of a prototypical Wall Street picture. But in her younger years, she was a strikingly pretty woman. This was a picture that she was quite proud of, and everywhere she moved, this picture was on the table. In the time I have tonight, I just want to talk a little bit about her life growing up in New Bedford and living in Vermont, New Jersey, New York, and then talk about some of her extraordinary qualities and why I believe she's unjustly overlooked. She was born Hetty Howland Robinson in 1834. The Howlands were New Bedford's most successful whaling family at a time when New Bedford and Fairhaven were just hitting their stride as the whaling capital of America, a title they inherited from Nantucket. Hetty was about 6 when the whaler Acushnet set sail from New Bedford carrying Herman Melville on the voyage that provided the fodder for Moby Dick. I like to think that they crossed paths down there by the docks. I think her experiences growing up in Quaker New Bedford did a lot to shape her life and really drove who she was. These are her parents, Abby Howland Robinson and Edward Black Hawk Robinson. Abby and her sister Sylvia, who we'll hear a little bit more about in a minute, were direct heirs to the Howland fortune. Her father, Edward, was an outsider from Rhode Island who married into the family and the fortune. Hetty rarely, if ever, talked about her mother. It was her father she worshiped. She showed little interest in the life she might have had of refinement up on the hill in New Bedford. Her favorite place was down on the whaling docks, reading the financial papers to her father and grandfather, both of whom had failing eyesight. As soon as I learned to read, it became my daily duty to read aloud to them the financial news of the world. In this way, I came to know what stocks and bonds were, how the markets fluctuated, and the meaning of bulls and bears. She estimated later that by the time she was in her mid-teens, she knew as much or more about business and finance than a lot of men who did that for a living. Hetty was an only child. She did have a brother who died in infancy, and I think that this is something that her father may have held against her. He was desperate for a male heir to raise and teach the business and hand it along to him, and the boy died, and what he got instead was this bright, vivacious, full of life girl, Hetty. And I don't think that it's too much of a stretch to say that her life can be seen as a quest to prove to this father, even long after his death, that she had what it took to handle the family money, to handle the fortune, build it and grow it and protect it. One of the things that she learned from her father was thrift. Although he was quite wealthy, he always smoked 4-cent cigars, and if anybody offered him a 10-cent one, he refused, because he said, if I smoke the 10-cent one, the 4-center won't taste good anymore. And Hetty later used to quote him saying, "My father taught me never to owe anything, not even a kindness." So Hetty suffered 3 principal betrayals in her life that helped shape who she was. The first 2 came in 1865 when she was 31 years old. She was living in New York. She had moved from New Bedford with her father after the death of Abby. Edward saw that the whaling industry was starting to wane. He was a very shrewd man. He moved his business affairs to New York, and Hetty was living with him there. And he had always been a very healthy man, but suddenly took ill and died in 1865. He left behind an estate of $5.7 million, to which he left Hetty about $900,000 outright and some real estate. The rest, about 80%, was bound up in trust to be handled by a couple of men that her father had appointed. Now, if you think conventionally, $900,000 and real estate plus the income on close to $5 million trust wouldn't be bad to get right now. I'd certainly take it. And so you can imagine back in 1865, that was more than enough to live any kind of life she wanted. It was wealth beyond the imagining of most people. But that's not what drove Hetty. She had this desire. She knew she had a financial genius, this genius for figures and this love and passion for money and investing. And so it drove her to distraction to think that these appointed male trustees were going to be managing the bulk of this money and sort of giving her the income from it. She spent 30 years fighting these poor guys in court until she finally got control of the money. The other major betrayal took place just a few weeks later, And that's Aunt Sylvia, who you saw in the video. And Aunt Sylvia was sickly her whole life. She had a debilitating spinal condition. She never married. She had no kids. And she had a fortune of about $2 million, which Hetty, as the sole direct heir, felt that she was entitled to. Again, she didn't want the income. She felt that she should manage all of that money. She could bring it all together and manage it. In fact, a few years earlier, she had browbeat Sylvia into signing a will, leaving it all to her. But while she was living in New York with her father, some advisors of Aunt Sylvia, helped her create a new will, unbeknownst to Hetty. And this will spread the money around a bit more. It gave about $1 million to civic improvements. A lot of it went to the public library in New Bedford. There was money for a water system, for steam power, for manufacturing in the city. There was money for poor sailors, and money to go to her servants and so forth. And the other half of $1 million would go to Hetty, but not really to Hetty, because it, as with her father's money, would be bound up in trust to be handled by male trustees. And then to put a capper on it, there was a provision that upon Hetty's death, dozens of relatives of the Howlands would receive a portion of the money. So a lot of people, Hetty was rumored to be kind of paranoid throughout her life, but she certainly had some justification for knowing that there was $1 million out there and a lot of people looking for her demise and counting the days. But so Hetty got wind of this, and she made her way as quickly as she could to New Bedford, where she produced magically a second page of that earlier will, as she called it, that she had written with Sylvia. And it said, in effect, it doesn't matter what additional wills Aunt Sylvia might ever sign, what I might ever, because it was supposedly in Aunt Sylvia's name, no matter what other wills might exist after this one, all the money goes to my niece Hetty. And it was signed Sylvia Ann Howland. Well, this wound up in court. It was one of the most celebrated civil court cases of the 19th century, and the first case at which the science of handwriting and what was a forgery or what was real was debated. And illuminaries no less than Oliver Wendell Holmes and Louis Agassiz from Harvard came forth to testify, yes, it was a forgery, no, it was genuine. But by the end of the case, it was pretty clear that Hetty had created that second page herself and probably traced the signature. She lost the case resoundingly, and with some sort of scuttlebutt going around that there might be some forgery charges potentially in the offing, Hetty retreated from New Bedford, retreated from the United States for a few years. She moved to England with her new husband, Edward Green. Edward Green was a financier. He was from Bellows Falls, Vermont. And it was a curious marriage because he was, unlike Hetty, who was very parsimonious, never wanted to spend a nickel. He was a big, affable man who loved having money. He'd made a fortune trading in the Far East and was a generous tipper, loved fine wines and expensive meals and so forth. So they were quite different characters. While in England, Hetty gave birth to a son, Edward, called Ned to differentiate from his father, and a daughter, Sylvia, named for Aunt Sylvia. After a few years, they returned to the United States, to Bellows Falls, Vermont, and this is the house they wound up living in. This was called the Tucker House, went back in Edward's family, and this became the principal home in Bellows Falls for many years. Now, if anything in Hetty Green's life can be said to be conventional, and not much could, this was a more or less conventional period of her life, the next decade or so. Hetty pretty much stayed in Vermont. She managed her money from afar. She kept it in New York. Edward would get on the train and go down to New York frequently to manage his money. They lived on Edward's money. Hetty kept the Howland fortune, every bit that she could get her hands on, separate, and did whatever she could to reinvest and grow it. She didn't mind her husband's spendthrift ways as long as it was his money that was being spent. So they lived at this more or less conventional life until 1885, when everything blew up. Hetty got word that a prominent New York banking and financial company called John J. Cisco & Son was suddenly on the verge of collapse. Now, this happened to be where Hetty kept $500,000 in cash on deposit. She also had a growing many millions of dollars in securities kept on hand at Cisco. So as soon as she heard that Cisco was in trouble, she immediately sent word saying, I want my deposit out and I want all of my securities sent over to the chemical bank in New York. And the assignee put in charge of handling the Cisco collapse said, you can have your money and you can have your securities as soon as you make good on your husband's debts. Because it turned out that in addition to being different in character-wise in terms of how they spent money, another difference was that Edward, despite his early success, was nowhere near the investor that Hetty Green was, and he was up to his neck in the very deal, a sort of railroad bond deal gone bad, that was sinking the company, Cisco. It turned out that Edward was up to his neck in that to the tune of $700,000. So this was that third great betrayal. And Hetty stormed down to New York and frantically tried to talk the assignee out of, she said, my money is my money, his is his, but he held fast. With shaking hands, she wrote out a check for $700,000. Effectively, it was the end of the marriage. They were never formally divorced. But they never lived together. They spent time together. She grabbed the kids and moved down to New York, determined to never live far away from her money again. It's kind of touching because I mentioned she had a soft side, because she really hated this and was so angry at him, but they stayed in touch. He sort of lived quietly in New York clubs and so forth, but from time to time would be her neighbor. And shortly before his death, around 1901, Hetty nursed him through his final months. She did have a heart, but you shouldn't cross her. So after that incident, Hetty moved her money over to the Chemical National Bank in New York, and there's the lobby and then some of the clerks who worked there. She became a familiar figure all around New York. This was sort of the start of her larger-than-life persona. She could be seen wearing sort of dark, dingy dresses that gave birth to the Witch of Wall Street title, getting off public transportation, going to the chemical bank, going across the street for a cheap lunch, getting on the ferry. Reporters followed her all over the place. She was often good for a quote. She loved playing cat and mouse with the press. And it was here that she displayed one of the qualities that I find most charming about Hetty, is her sense of humor. She, as I say, she became sort of the first queen of the soundbite. One of the groups of people she hated just about more than anybody were lawyers. She was apologies to any attorneys here. She was in and out of court her entire life and always assumed that they were trying to rip her off. And she once told one reporter, "There are only two things I fear in life, lightning and a religious lawyer. I don't even know what that means, but it always cracks me up. When she had to ultimately pay that $2 dog license in Hoboken in order to stay in Hoboken, she said, "It's mighty extravagant, but a dog's worth more than a lawyer anyhow. Barks louder for you and don't cost near as much." I mentioned she liked to play cat and mouse with the press. They staked her out, they followed her. This was her building in Hoboken that is still there. It's called the Yellow Flats Building. And when she didn't feel like dealing with the press, she would go out the back way, and this is the view from the alleyway. When she did, she'd go out the front and give them a quote or two. But she had the nameplate on her apartment door was C. Dewey, because she thought that would throw them off. Now, Dewey was the name of her dog, and C stood for Cutie, which was her nickname for Dewey. So it was Cutie Dewey. She knew that reporters were paying women who lived in the apartment building with her, it was a very middle-class apartment building, to pass along any scuttlebutt they could dig up, any gossip, any rumors, anything they could overhear from Hetty so they could put it in the paper. Now, Hetty got wind of this, and it was about the time that her daughter Sylvia was rumored to be about to be married, and the papers were frantic to know who Sylvia was going to marry, what the details were going to be, and so forth. Now, Hetty knew this, and she also knew that one of the best ways to pass gossip in this building was through the dumbwaiter, and it was this sort of long sort of funnel that went from floor to floor. And so Hetty went over one day and opened the door, and pretended to have a conversation with a friend, saying, "Boy, I really put one over on the fellas in the press. Sylvia was married last week, and they were none the wiser." And sure enough, it was reported in the papers, and the papers sheepishly had to retract the story a few days later. It was the kind of game she loved to play. Another quality she had was tremendous courage, and I think, as you saw from the picture at on the front at the start of the lecture, that sort of very stern, frightening look. She kind of had to do that as the lone woman financier of the Gilded Age. She went toe to toe against some of the toughest men of her age and never batted an eye. As she told one interviewer, "I always try to deal justly with everyone, but if anyone wants to fight me, I'll give him all the fight he wants." Now, that was never more true than her interactions with this gentleman, Collis P. Huntington, who grew up in a town in Connecticut not far from where I live, but he went on to become one of the big four leaders of the Transcontinental Railroad. And he was a business genius. He was also a notorious bully who threw the fear of you-know-what into everyone from Western wheat farmers to United States senators. Hetty wasn't impressed or intimidated, and in fact, she blamed Huntington for the Cisco failure. It was a railroad bond deal gone wrong, and she felt that Huntington was behind that, trying to earn a quick buck by stiffing investors. And so she vowed revenge. And she sent her son Ned who was handling affairs for her, down to Texas to buy a small railroad that she knew was positioned perfectly to gum up his works in trying to create a southern leg on the Transcontinental Railroad. So Hetty loved to tell the story about the day that Huntington came into her office in New York and said, "Your boy is making a lot of trouble for me down in Texas, and if it doesn't stop, I'm going to have him thrown in jail." Now, Hetty had a souvenir pistol on her desk, and she looked at Huntington, and then she looked at the pistol, and then she looked at Huntington, and she said, "Huntington, until now, you've been dealing with Hetty Green, the businesswoman. Now you're dealing with Hetty Green, the mother. You harm one hair on my boy's head and I'll put a bullet through your heart. Now, the way Hetty told it may be apocryphal, but it's a great story nonetheless. Huntington left in such a hurry he had to send a messenger for his hat the next day. But while she was ruthless and fearless in dealing with enemies, she was remarkably fair in a lot of ways. She really became, I mentioned earlier, she had the power to move markets. She became kind of a one-woman bank. As you saw in the video, she loaned money to New York City on a couple of occasions so they could pay their workers. She loaned the money that became provided the capital for the water system in Tucson, Arizona. She loaned money at below market value to church after church after church. People came to her for loans, and if you weren't her enemy, she often provided quite generous terms. In 1907, at the outbreak of the Knickerbocker financial crisis, when J.P. Morgan assembled the leading financial figures of the time to his home on East 36th Street to hammer out the plans for what would become the Federal Reserve, one woman was invited to those meetings. That was Hetty Green. Such was her power at that time that when I was researching, I found newspaper stories declaring the interest rates that Hetty Green was currently setting on the business pages of newspapers, which, is kind of the way they do for the Fed now. Which brings me to what I see as her most important quality and the one most unjustly overlooked, her financial genius. I mentioned Warren Buffett, who always said that investing, when he gets asked, what's the secret of investing? As though there's some kind of scientific formula that you need to learn, he's always said that it revolves around simple fundamental rules. Of course, those rules are incredibly difficult to follow. It takes discipline, courage, financial acumen, and all the rest in order to put them into action. And that's what Hetty did long before Warren Buffett was born. One rule, don't panic when others are panicking. In fact, when other people were panicking, that was really Hetty's time to shine. And I'll give you just one of many examples. An early example, shortly after the Civil War, hard to think now when you think U.S. Treasuries as being sort of the foundation of any bond portfolio that an investor has today because they're so sound. But right after the Civil War, the country still felt a little shaky, and there was some question about whether the government was going to be able to make good on its bonds. And so at one point, people began panicking, and they began selling bonds, and the price dropped down to 40 cents on the dollar in some cases. And Hetty, instead of panicking, very calmly bought up every bond she could get her hands on. And she estimated that by doing that, she earned $1.25 million in a single year just on that one investment. Another rule that she lived by was be patient. Spot your opportunities. Don't jump into things. She was not a speculator. And when you do spot an opportunity, act decisively and courageously. One of my favorite stories involved when a group of New York bankers was getting ready to try to make a hostile takeover of a Georgia railroad called the Georgia Central. Hetty got wind of this effort, and she very calmly, quietly started buying up shares until she owned $6,700 shares of this stock, which she bought for about $70 a piece. Now, once the word got out about that, the share price began to rise. the big vote was coming up, and the New York investors started getting nervous, and they came to Hetty and they said, look, they thought they might not win the vote without her. She knew she had them. They offered her $115 a share. She said, I'll take $125 a share. They went back and talked to each other. They came back and they said, okay, we'll give you $125 a share, but if you're going to charge us that much, you have to wait until after the deal goes through, and then we'll pay you. She said, if I have to wait, it's $130 a share. And she had that kind of nerves of steel. There was, in all likelihood, that deal could have blown up, and she could have been right back where she started from. But she was calm. She didn't blink. They did. And she ultimately walked away from that deal with a profit of $385,000, or more than $12 million in today's value, on a single deal. Above all, I think this is another, not to keep coming back to Warren Buffett, but the parallels are really intriguing. He always talks about the power of compounding, which simply means reinvesting, the ability of money to grow exponentially. If you invest it, reinvest it, you don't spend it, you don't get the dividend income and go out and have a party, you put it all back in the investments. And in this way, she was able to, her money grew exponentially over the years. And I think that for all of these qualities and for being the first woman to do this, she was always judged. I think one of the reasons why she's overlooked or not given fair credit for her financial genius, I think that men of that era, or maybe of any era, there was no shortage of oddball characters among the men of the Gilded Age. But they tended to get judged first by what kind of a businessman they were. What did they do? What did they build? And secondarily, by what were their personality quirks. Hetty inevitably was judged, what kind of a lady was she? And then secondarily, if at all, what kind of a businesswoman was she? And ultimately on that, partly because deliberately she went around like that, I think it helped her keep her adversaries off guard. She came up short on that what kind of a lady she was assessment. And a lot of people just assumed that she was a miserable woman, that she had to be unhappy. And I think that's because she didn't do with her money what they would do, didn't do what I would do. I think I would be having parties. The assessment of a journalist, Mabel Potter Daggett, in 1907 said, Hetty Green is really bankrupt in desire. With money to buy all that the world has for sale, it holds nothing that she would like. But I don't think that's true. What is happiness? We're all looking for happiness, but I think in her own context, she was a happy woman. She did something she was passionate about. She had a mission. She loved her life. She loved what she did. And I don't think she was miserable. When she died in 1916, her death was front page news in papers coast to coast. Today, though, she's largely forgotten. Why is that? I think one reason is that unlike some of the men from that age, she didn't build a Carnegie Hall, a Rockefeller Foundation, Frick museums, any of those things by which those figures transformed themselves from robber barons into great philanthropists. Hetty did not erect any monuments to herself or build anything. In fact, the one building that I know of that bears her name is Green Hall, which is the administration building at my mother's alma mater, Wellesley College. That was built long after her death by her son, Ned, and Hetty would have heartily disapproved. Going to close up here. These are her kids, Ned and Sylvia. As I mentioned, one of the ironies, you can't see Hetty, I don't think, as anything but a pioneering feminist in her own actions, in her own behavior, raised her kids very differently. Ned, she groomed to be the man to handle the business. Sylvia was groomed to be her companion and stayed with her and lived with her in her various homes. Ned came to be a larger-than-life figure. I'm sure there's people around here who know a lot about him and his legacy at Round Hill. He also had quite a legacy in Texas. The Colonel was an honorary title he was given in Texas. He was the first man to drive a powered automobile across Texas. When he came back to the East Coast, built a mansion in Dartmouth and in South Dartmouth, where he had a fantastic radio station and broadcast music and invited people to come out and sit on the beach and listen to music and boxing matches. He had an airstrip. He had a science lab that MIT ultimately used. He became a larger-than-life character. One of the great ironies, if Hetty's huge quest in life was to preserve this fortune and keep it in the family, she was so worried that her kids would marry interlopers who would come in and find a way to run off with the fortune, that she discouraged suitors to the point that both married quite late in life. Neither had any children. When Ned died in 1936, he left his half of the fortune to Sylvia. When she died, she was living very quietly in Greenwich, Connecticut. When she died in 1951, she left the money to any number of distant relatives, colleges and universities, private schools, public works, you name it. So it was kind of scattered to the wind, which is why I closed my book saying that Hetty had set out to win a man's game. She played it ferociously, courageously, and brilliantly. She had played it perhaps a bit too well. So thank you. Where is she buried? She's buried in Bellows Falls, Vermont. And in fact, one of the touching things that I talk about a little bit in her book, I mentioned that she's buried next to Edward, her husband. And she, late in life, she converted from, she was never super religious, church-going wise, but she converted to Episcopal, which was his religion. And I think the reason was pretty much because that burial ground only buried Episcopalians. But it was touching that that's where she wanted her final resting place to be. Could Hetty have met the benefactor of this building? You know, I had that very thought, and I have to confess that until Mark filled me in about him, I was not, it's a gap. And what a great story, and what irony that he made his fortune in petroleum, which, edged New Bedford, Fairhaven economy out of the picture, and because of whale oil. I don't know, but I wasn't really aware of him until very recently, and I like to think, because they were definitely contemporaries, so they must have bumped into each other. But I had that very same thought, and sorry, I don't have an answer. Was there truth to the fact that she wouldn't spend money for her son's health problems? The principal health problem was the leg that, and I alluded that in the video. Ned, at a young age, had a sledding accident and badly injured his knee. I don't know whether it might have been a dislocated kneecap. I'm not sure exactly what it was, but it was a chronic condition that worsened over time. He grew to be a very large, like his father, and walked on the leg. It worsened, and ultimately, at the age of 18 or 19, he had the leg amputated at the knee. Now, the cottage industry, or the urban legend that's sort of grown up around that, was simply that Hetty Green was too mean to get it treated, and so her son had to have his leg cut off. And that fits that miser story. I think the story's a lot more complicated. Ned really was the love of her life, Over the years, she tried any number of remedies. She did take him to doctors over and over again. Over the years, she tried home remedies, which were a much bigger part of the mix at the time, to try, and there was just nothing that apparently could be done for this condition. She did some extremely unattractive things with regard to Ned and his leg. One of them was taking him to free medical clinics or going to doctors dressed in old clothes and claiming to be hardship cases so that he could get treated for free. So she is not without blame, and I'm not suggesting that she is on that, but I think that the story that she was just too mean and so get your leg cut off because I'm not paying for it is just one of those sort of boiled down to the essence of this miser story that people love to embrace. Interesting. Well, he did have a prosthetic leg, so he walked on it. He limped, but it sounds like him. You know, he was an amazing character. There was another woman that I met while doing research, and she's no longer with us, unfortunately. Her name was Barbara Bedell. I don't know if anybody knew her, but she lived at Round Hill in one of the condominiums and became passionate about his life and wrote a wonderful, I think it might have been self-published or published by a local press, but I don't remember the name off the top of my head, but she was a lovely woman and did a wonderful book about his colorful life. Was I surprised by anything? That's a great question. I think what surprised me was that every time I would start to really like her and think, wow, she's great, I would find out some terrible things she did. And I would write her off and I'd say, God, how could I be writing about this woman? She's so mean. And then I would come across something else, and she would be touchingly kind. There was the time when she had this friend, Annie Leary, in New York, who was a wealthy woman and very prominent in New York philanthropy. And there was a story of her one time saying to Annie Leary, "Oh, Annie, am I really as awful as they say I am?" And but there were a lot of stories. The jackpot would have been to find conclusive evidence that she was secretly bankrolling a lot of philanthropies on the side. But there's enough to think that she probably was giving a fair amount of money away, especially since this friend of hers, Annie Leary, was known for philanthropy. It's hard for me to believe that she wasn't doing that. But knowing what I do know about Hetty, she wouldn't have wanted anybody to know about that because she wouldn't have wanted to have been hounded. One of the reasons she moved around so much was because she didn't want tax collectors to be able to prove where she lived. And ultimately, she wound up, the estate was settled in Vermont, which, New York and New Jersey piled in and tried to get in, and she had worked it so that Vermont wound up being the state of her death, and that, by no coincidence, had the lowest estate taxes. Well, thank you all very much. This is just, I haven't... I'm really moved by this turnout. It's just wonderful. I haven't spoken in a room this beautiful in front of this many wonderful people. It's doing a lot for me, so thank you for coming.
On behalf of the Historical Society, we would like to thank Mr. Slack for the wonderful lecture, and thank you all for coming tonight and for your donations.